Okay, lesson two deals with the political culture in Texas, and we sort of alluded to the political culture in Texas in our last lecture when we talked about how the history of Texas really plays into the policies that are sort of developed, and how in 1876, with the creation of the Constitution of 1876, which is our current Constitution, the framers really did that in light of a severe mistrust of government. And so this is going to shape the political culture in Texas. The events that occurred in Texas history, especially after the Civil War time period, really going to create a conservative political culture in Texas that has lasted even into modern day. And I think I even talked about last time that even though we have had a couple of different political parties dominate in Texas over the course of our history, it isn't necessarily going to change our political culture because we have followed conservatism. And the Democratic Party was very conservative, and then there was a gradual switch of parties, and the Republican Party became the one that was much more conservative. And so we have sort of followed the political party that has taken up the mantle of conservatism and utilize that as part of their platform. And so our learning objectives today are analyze issues, policies, and political culture in Texas. We're definitely going to be dealing with that second part there. Explain the origins and development of the Texas Constitution. And so our essential question is, our essential questions are, what type of political culture typifies Texas? And what elements or events affected the development of the Texas Constitution, which we have already started talking about in our last lecture. But political culture is defined as the attitudes, values, and beliefs that most people in a political community have about the proper role of government. And so it is essentially how individuals see government and what governments are supposed to do, and the roles that citizens are supposed to take in government. And so it essentially defines the role of government and the role of citizens within that government. And although the average person probably does not possess much technical knowledge about government or how it works, most people do have views and opinions. And even if they are poorly defined views and opinions, they have these ideas about what government should and should not do. And they have these ideas of what their own personal responsibilities should be. And again, even if they are poorly defined ideas or opinions, we hold those pretty dear. And so one of the things that we're not supposed to talk about in polite society is politics and religion, right? Because those things are very closely held opinions that when you question them, even if you're doing it from a good place, when people question your politics, you sort of get a little bit, your hackles kind of come up a little bit, and you really feel very defensive. And so, anyway, political culture is going to be affected by a number of different things. And your political culture could be shaped by the demographics within a region, the type of people that live there. It can be shaped by our economics, and by and large, it's going to be a significant impactor as to how the political culture in Texas is defined. It can be shaped by religion, which is also a major player in the political culture in Texas. Your education and what role education should play in society, as well as your views on immigration. Those really shape political culture as well. Now, there are a couple of, or three different types of political culture that have been defined in the United States. And in the 1960s, a political scientist named Daniel J. Elazar is going to classify different types of political cultures in a book called American Federalism, A View from the States. And so it's going to essentially outline the different types of political culture that are found within the United States, depending on the region that you were in. And these different types of political culture are going to include moralistic, individualistic, and traditionalistic. And so we're going to look at each one of these individually. Okay, so if we look at moralistic political culture, Moralistic political culture essentially has the view that government is very positive and it's an instrument for change. It's a means of promoting the citizens' general welfare, right? And politics is essentially the responsibility of everyone in society, all citizens. You should play a role in politics, and in doing so, you will be an instrument for positive change, and you will promote the well-being of everybody. You have an obligation almost to participate in government, to go out and vote, to make calls on behalf of political candidates. And if you are a leader, if you decide to take on a leadership role in society, in government, in politics, you do that not for personal gain, but as a desire to serve. So it's more of an intrinsic thing. It's a desire to help your fellow human, make sure that each citizen has a good general welfare, and it's not because you are trying to seek some kind of personal power. And anybody who has a moralistic political culture or view of politics says that the government has the responsibility to intervene in private affairs for the public good or for the public well-being. And so anything that is deemed necessary for the public good or for the well-being of the community, the government should step in. They have a right and an obligation to intervene. And so this is sort of the moralistic view of political culture. And so we turn to individualistic political culture. And in an individualistic political culture, we're going to see this idea that the government is created to handle the demands by the people. Okay? Government is created to serve people. It is not concerned with creating a good society. It is simply handling the demands of the people that it serves. Government intervention in the private sector should really be kept at a minimum. It shouldn't be something that the government does. The private sector should essentially regulate itself, and the government should only intervene in specific situations. And so it's not really, the job is not really to create a good society. Anybody with an individualistic political culture really deems politics as sort of the dirty work. It is not a high calling that you get into intrinsically to promote the well-being of everybody. That's not the role of government in an individualistic society. It's not a high calling. It should be left to those suited to do dirty work. There are people within society who are more Machiavellian in nature, perhaps, and they can do the dirty work and be less bothered by it consciously. And there are people who can't. And so, in an individualistic political culture, you're not joining politics. You're not participating in politics in an effort to do the right thing, essentially, to go out and make a wonderful society for everybody. Sometimes politics requires that an individual do some dirty work, and a lot of time these people who are guided by intrinsic motivations are not suited to do that dirty work. And so participation is necessary, but it's not necessarily an obligation. And so, we participate in government because we have to. Not necessarily because we have to, because it's not an obligation, but we participate in government because if somebody doesn't participate in government, it is not going to be successful. But it is not necessarily an obligation, and by and large, you should allow people to engage in government who are suited to engage in government. And then we have the traditionalistic political culture. And essentially, the goal of a traditionalistic political culture is to ensure that the existing political order, the status quo, is maintained. There's no real other primary goal but to maintain the existing political order. Participation in government is confined to a very small, self-perpetuating elite. And so the public is going to have very little influence and power over what happens within a government. And a traditionalistic political culture is really most it's going to play out in a society that has very specific class-based social structures. And these class-based social structures really help to maintain the existing order, because everybody knows where they fall within the social structure, and it is going to be up to that elite to really run the government and maintain the existing order. And so it sometimes can maybe not represent everybody in a traditionalistic type of political culture, but nevertheless. And so we have to think about what is the political ideology here in Texas. What is it that we aspire to here in Texas? Not really aspire to, but what is it that we are sort of governed by? And if we think back to that first lecture about how we, by and large, historically mistrust government, and we seek to protect the freedoms and civil liberties of people, we can really see some clues as to what type of political culture we typify here in Texas. And so we really have kind of a mix between these two political cultures. We have a very traditionalistic and individualistic type of political culture in Texas. And so this is going to harken back a lot to some of Texas' early settlers that can provide some insight into our political culture. Mexican immigrants contributed to a very strong traditionalistic political culture, which had its origins in Spanish political culture. And when the Southern Anglo settlers came into East Texas, they brought with them also a traditionalistic type of culture. Traditionalistic type of culture is sort of plays out as an extension of the practice of slavery that persisted after the Civil War. African American slaves were forced to sort of adopt this traditionalistic culture of the Anglo slave owners. Now, because Texas is so large and diverse, we had some other settlers that came in. We had a significant group of German and Midwestern Anglo settlers that came into West Texas that brought with them a very strong individualistic culture. And so few of these people were slave owners, and they came to Texas really in search of individual opportunities. And so based on this heritage, we can sort of see a mix between the traditionalistic and individualistic types of political culture here in Texas. Okay, we sort of we really fit into this mix model quite well, and when we start looking at the government, we'll start to realize that the government is very limited, and power is going to be divided among a whole bunch of elected officials, with a very weak executive authority, which sort of plays back to that idea that we distrust government. We have fewer state regulations, and we really have a pro-business type of policy. So if we look at a map of the United States, and I'm sorry that I don't have one here for you, but the traditionalistic style of political culture is very, very common amongst the southern states, those states that were part of the Confederate States of America, and some of those border states like Kentucky. And then when you move out to New Mexico and Arizona, those are very traditionalistic as well. You're going to see individualistic states in places like California, Nevada, Alaska, Wyoming, Nebraska, into some of those Midwestern states like Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. And then when you get up into certain areas of New England with Massachusetts and Rhode Island, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, New York, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, those are very individualistic in nature as well, as is Alaska. And then the moralistic, the one that's more intrinsically motivated, you're going to see those up into the Pacific Northwest and Washington and Oregon and Idaho, even out in places like Utah, Colorado, some in Kansas as well. up into some of those other Midwestern states, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, and then up in the extreme areas of New England like Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire, as well as Hawaii. So if we were to sort of divide this out, you could really take a map of the United States and really determine where you can find these different types of political culture. Okay. We are usually classified more traditionalistic, but we do have that mix of individualism. Okay. Now, another thing, and I apologize for this slide. I wanted to try to get all of this onto one slide, and so things are a little bit smaller, but that's okay. Political culture sort of gives way to political ideology. It's guided by political ideology, which is a set of principles, ideals, doctrines, etc., that explain how society should work. And so our political ideology in Texas that really helps to shape our political culture, it does include certain things. Okay. There is this idea of classic liberalism. Now, you have to understand that we're not using liberalism in the sense of the term that we use it in the United States today. I'm not talking about liberal Democrats, because as we know, that is not something that that Texas really aspires to or supports. Liberalism, however, is when we talk about it in a political science sense, is a term that deals with anybody who agrees with the protection of individual rights, who agrees with a limited government, who agrees with the rule of law, who agrees with a free market economy. And these are going to be based in the writings of people like John Locke and Thomas Jefferson and Adam Smith and James Madison, who were all proponents of a very limited government and the protection of individual rights. And it's Locke that's going to talk about the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and property, which will be borrowed from Locke by Jefferson when writing the Declaration of Independence and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Adam Smith being the father of capitalism, and James Madison, who is going to be a significant figure in writing the Constitution. So there are these ideas enshrined in our government, and political ideology in Texas has an element of this classical liberalism, because we certainly like a limited government. And when we start looking at the Texas Constitution, we're going to see significant rights and liberties that are going to be protected by that Constitution in minute detail. And this idea of a free market economy, we're very pro-business in Texas, and we like this idea of capitalism and free market economy. But we also have social conservatism that sort of shapes our political ideology and our political culture. This idea of abortion, this idea that Roe versus Wade, the Supreme Court decision that essentially legalizes abortion, should be overturned, right? That is one of the things that, by and large, in Texas is very specific and really plays into the development of social policies here within our state. The conduct of prayer in schools. By and large, Texas is very pro-school prayer. Alternatives to the theory of evolution. There's always a huge fight between, at the State Board of Education level, about should we teach evolution? Should we teach creationism or intelligent design or whatever? But many of us are very uncompromising in our views regarding these social issues, and social conservatism is really going to be a huge part of our political ideology. And most of the time, this conservatism is going to be grounded in our religious faith. And so, while we do embrace in Texas classic liberalism with all of those things, we also embrace this idea of social conservatism that sort of tries to either maintain the social order, the status quo, or sort of take it back to the way that it once was. But we also have something else added to this mix, and it's this idea of populism, and I say it's peppered into the mix because it's not huge, but it does affect our political ideology. And if you are a populist, by and large, you are going to it's sort of difficult to define what a populist is, but it's widely agreed that they call for the federal and state government to help small businesses, farmers, and ranchers in the face of competition from large U.S. corporation and foreign businesses. And so they want to have a protection of those small business owners, those small farmers, those small ranchers in the face of large corporation or foreign entities. They have also, railroad plays a huge role in Texas history, and populists have really called for the regulation of railroads and railroad rates. That's really hard to say. And if we look back at Governor Jim Hogg, who was a very populist, progressive individual within our state history, he presided over government when the Texas Railroad Commission was developed. There's a huge distrust of banks that probably harkens back to that Great Depression time period, and they're historically anti-immigration individuals. And so populism also has an element of anti-intellectual, a mistrust of experts. And so we do kind of see some of this populism sort of in the recipe here for the Texas political ideology. We have these main ingredients of classical liberalism, social conservatism, with maybe a dash of populism that really sort of helps to guide our political culture. And because it is these things that we believe in, we can see a traditionalistic and individualistic political culture that sort of emerges in Texas and has taken root in Texas since essentially our inception, but specifically after the Civil War and Reconstruction and the development of the 1876 Constitution. And so we're going to leave off right here for today. And in our next lesson, or for now, in our next lesson, we are going to start looking at the Texas State Constitution a little bit more in depth. And our next two lectures really deal with that Texas State Constitution. We're going to introduce it in the next lecture, give some background information, and then we're going to look at the anatomy of the Texas State Constitution in Lesson 4. All right, so I'll see you then. Thanks.